Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Marin Economic Briefing for the month of December. My name is Mike Blakely, and I am the CEO of the Marin Economic Forum. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization providing research and advisory on the Marin County and Bay Area economy. Thank you for joining us for this economic briefing this morning. We're going to have a bit of a focus on the labor market today. As you all know, the big headlines in the news over the past few weeks has been layoffs in the tech sector and other professional services sector. So we're going to dig in a little bit about what that might mean here in Marin County. But we're also going to do as we normally do, which is to take all of you through indicators, key economic indicators at the national, state, and local level, all in an attempt to understand what has been happening in the economy. And I have to say, this year has been one unlike others, whether it starts with the war in Ukraine at the beginning of the year, through the major inflationary pressures all year, to these recent layoffs. And there's all kinds of things happening, not just in the business sector, but the global economy generally. Here to walk us through all of this is the chief economist for the Marin Economic Forum, Dr. Rob Eiler. Good morning, Rob.
Morning, Mike. Thanks so much. And folks, thanks for coming and joining us today. As Mike said, what we're going to do is we're going to start with a walk through the national economy and try to put our arms around what the latest forecast is and what may be coming. And then we'll talk about the labor market, both in Marin County and the Greater Bay Area, in a couple different ways to wrap up. So what I usually like to do to get started is I like to think about where we're at in terms of the labor market. And since we're still in a mix of recovery and expansion in the American economy, depending on where you are in the United States, I like to start with this comparison to the Great Recession. It took 78 months to go from the November 2007 level of employment in the United States to get back that same aggregate level of jobs. And this is why we call it the Great Recession. And this is the continued emergence from the pandemic. Once you cross that red dotted line, you go from economic recovery from the most recent recession into what's known as economic expansion. So in essence, we have now recovered jobs in the American economy and are in expansion mode. However, that expansion path has been a little bit flat. The key is we're in that mode. So one of the reasons why we have not had what you could consider to be a declared recession yet in the United States is because jobs in the United States continue to truck along and grow, even if unemployment is rising a little bit. And I'll come back and talk about that in just a second. The key for economists who think about, are we actually in recession or not, is a downturn in what we think of as payroll employment. So as long as this number, which at 100.9 means we're 100.9% where we were in January 2020, which means we fully recovered and beyond in terms of jobs through the pandemic and beyond, that number if that keeps growing, it's going to be very difficult to say we're actually in recession. Now, that doesn't mean that certain industries are not still reeling a little bit from the pandemic and perhaps on the precipice or inside of a structural change as we speak. So what I like to do is I like to walk people through the evolution of job changes in the United States starting in April 2020 and May 2020. This is where we saw the big contraction versus the pre-pandemic benchmark, and I tend to use January 2020, as we just saw in the previous graph, as that beginning date. But the point is that every single sector in the American economy was originally cut in terms of jobs some way or the other in those first 2 months after the pandemic started. And then through the next 2 years, through the end of 2020 and through the end of December 2021, we basically had only one industry that had grown, and that was transportation and warehousing. Through November 2022, these data just came out last Friday. You're seeing across the board recovery, except for a few specific industries. And what's so kind of great from a teaching standpoint about this slide is that all the industries, until you get to accommodation, have seen recovery. Those percentage changes that are positive means that with respect to January 2020 through November 2022, there has actually been jobs growth. So all those industries have recovered except for the ones we call accommodation, hotels, motels, food services, drinking places, bars and restaurants, and any eating establishment that sells food in a prepared way, regardless of its location, and other personal services, which is an array of personal services, including hair salons, nail salons, fitness centers. Those three categories of jobs in the United States have still not recovered. And in fact, hotel jobs are down relatively significantly. Now, for bars, restaurants, and other personal services, we're expecting those jobs in 2023 to kind of peak out probably just a little bit below full recovery, but it's in accommodation, hotels and motels that we may not see full recovery perhaps through the end of this decade. And that means we might have structural change in that industry. And I'll come back and talk about that later in the context of Marin County, but keep your eyes on that one. This is a really good one though, because it really says that there's 3 standout industries that are still not recovered, but everybody else basically moving left to right on this graph has come back. One of the biggest global issues that remains, and has really been a stubborn economic piece of data in terms of how policy's been able to address it, is inflation. The Federal Reserve watches what's called core personal consumption expenditures and in the price of those expenditures. And what that really means is, if you think of a shopping cart full of everything that consumers buy every month, and I look back 1 year, how much has the cost of that shopping cart changed? That's that October 5% you see there as the number. But core means that I take that shopping cart and I pull food and energy products out of it. And that's the true change I'm looking for. In other words, the core. And that's because historically food and energy prices tend to be more volatile than what we think of as core goods and services. And that's really what that solid blue line is measuring on a monthly basis, looking back 12 months. So that's the evolution of the increase over 12 months of that shopping cart's cost. However, you can see that in 2022, and really it's a little hard to see on this graph, but that peak happened in January, February 2022, and has been sliding down a little bit in trend, but has been very stubborn and actually moving through a path that looks like it's going to go through those red dots. And those red dots are what the Federal Reserve thinks is the best forecast, assuming that they have their policy framework worked out to move that solid blue line through those red dots. The blue dotted line at the bottom is where the Federal Reserve wants to be on a long-term basis. And these data are monthly looking back to January 2007. And you can see that the 2010s were kind of a time where we had an amazing run of really simple movements in inflation, very predictable, below what the Federal Reserve kind of had as its target rate. And this is why we kept interest rates low for so long, because inflation had not quite picked up enough to provide businesses with that sort of slow, steady price increase to cover cost increases. We're now in a situation where we're really trying to shape it through those red dots and trying to get back to something that looks like a pre-pandemic norm. But inflation has been nasty, and that's because inflation initially was always viewed as a demand side phenomenon. We now really believe as economists that we have to be thinking more in supply side as well. And so until there's some global issues that clean up, we're not going to see these data move very quickly down toward that blue dotted line. So what's next is that we're hearing a lot of rhetoric coming out of the Federal Reserve that in fact they're going to slow down, if not stop, the ascension of interest rates that they set. So they set a very special rate in our economy called the interbank rate, or what in our country is called the federal funds rate, and a target range for those transactions where banks are lending to other banks. That then changes short-term interest rates, or at least has pressure on them to change. And that's what we're now starting to see across the board in the American economy, is short-term rates and long-term rates have picked up. And what we're concerned about, and this is why the Federal Reserve is thinking about maybe slowing down and maybe even cutting rates in 2023, is we're concerned about what's called the yield curve inversion and how that might slow down credit markets and ultimately create more recession pressure than is necessary. So we're going to watch how the Federal Reserve reads all those macro data and then starts thinking about what it's going to do next. We have to imagine, though, with the ascension in mortgage rates and a slower moving economy and really quick ascension of housing prices over the last few years, we're going to start to see some give back in housing prices. Now, is that a disaster like we saw in 2006 through 2010? The answer is no. There's no reason and no data out there that suggests we're going to repeat that performance. But we have to be thinking that as in any equity market, when you see those kind of gains and the conditions that were supporting those gains are reversing, the prices in those markets are going to start to reverse as well. And the equity markets, otherwise, thinking the stock market as a prime example of that, have also been reversing because they're in many ways have the same basic foundations. So right now, the betting money is out there at about a 10 or 15% average downturn in housing prices in 2023 and maybe a little bit slipping into 2024, but that's after average gains of somewhere around 40% across the United States over the last 3 years. We should also expect job losses are coming. And as Mike alluded to right off the top, tech jobs in specific have made headline news in terms of cutbacks. The key there is how broad-based those changes become. So watch for logistics, because that's been in very fast hiring. So you got to expect that some of that's going to be seen as over hiring by firms like Amazon. You have to expect in brick and mortar retail that some of that comeback is going to start to moderate, especially if the economy slows down, and tourism that supports a lot of brick and mortar retail, especially in our region and including the greater Bay Area, is going to see a little bit of a sag in demand and then continued tech job losses. So the key, and we'll come back and talk about this in just a minute, is how those generalize, and more specifically, the thing I watch is whether or not they generalize to start affecting construction employment. Because when construction employment starts to sag, that then tells a story that the housing market is not providing developers with enough incentives to continue to work on projects that may be permitted but not started yet, and that'll start to fade construction jobs. Right now, and I'll just give you a little foreshadowing, Marin County still is burgeoning along and still seeing that click up of construction jobs. The Bay Area otherwise is starting to flatten out a little bit. Here's a forecast that just came out in November 2022. So the Federal Reserve every quarter surveys 40 forecasters and what they call the Survey of Professional Forecasters. And they ask, what's your median forecast for a bunch of different variables? And I pick out 3 of them. One is real GDP growth, which basically is income after inflation and the growth of that for the American economy. The unemployment rate, which regardless of your viewpoint of how good or bad that metric is, it's at least a kind of a bellwether where payroll employment is going, and really kind of in essence, another way to think about how policymakers are going to look at continued changes in interest rates with respect to how the American economy is reacting on the labor market side. And then those core PCE inflation numbers, basically the same red dots we saw 2 slides ago. Now, since these are from November 2022, I wanted to give you a perspective. This year, we actually have had 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth in the first and second quarter. And so we were in technical recession after the second quarter this year, but then that ended because in the third quarter, we saw a pickup of real GDP growth. And we should expect the fourth quarter to also be somewhat positive for ultimately a positive year, all said and done. The trick is what's happening underneath the economy in terms of lingering inflation, relatively high interest rates that are going to start to have their effects on the macroeconomy over the next 12 months, because there is some policy lag as interest rates go up. It does take 9 to 12 months generally for all the effects of rising interest rates to start to float into the economy. Easiest way to characterize that in your mind is think, well, when interest rates rise and mortgage rates rise, it takes a little while for both the demand side and the supply side of the housing markets to start to react to those rates, because they're trying to feel each other out and trying to figure out whether or not it's time to stop buying homes and time to stop building homes. And then those broader effects start to hit the economy. That's one good, simple example about thinking about what's called a policy lag. And we're starting to feel those policy changes now on the economy. To a certain extent, that's exactly what these forecasters think. So if you notice, the shaded column here is the latest forecast. The column to its left is the previous forecast. So notice that for 2022, the forecast is picked up because the third quarter was actually a little bit better than a lot of economists expected. So for the year overall, they're expecting a little better outcome. But for 2023, they're expecting those policy effects to start to really cascade on the American economy. And they've cut the forecast basically in half for growth from just 1 quarter ago, which was 1.3% for 2023. Then as we move in through the middle part of the decade, it's starting to get back to kind of, let's say, pre-pandemic conditions. The unemployment rate is starting to pick up a little bit. So same deal, that shaded area is this quarter's forecast. The not shaded area to its left is last quarter's forecast. Each one of those kind of going into the next year or so is starting to pick up because we're expecting unemployment to lift. Now, I told you I'd tell you this or come back to this topic in just a second, and here we are. One of the reasons we should expect the unemployment rate to increase is because we're going to see people come back into what's still a relatively frothy labor market who have been outside of the counted labor force and are attracted based on businesses offering relatively higher wages than, let's say, 1 year ago, and perhaps a need at home to go back to work for economic reasons. So both of those reasons kind of drawing people back into the labor force. If those folks do not find a job right away, they will augment the level of the unemployed as the labor force picks back up a little bit, and thus leave us with a slightly higher level of unemployment. They will be joined by folks who are unfortunately also going to lose their current employment status, and thus we should see some liftoff. In many ways, this is exactly what the Federal Reserve expected as it increased interest rates, and the threading of the needle from a policy standpoint is how much unemployment pressure do I create to try to curb the inflation problem and do it in such a way that I don't have medium to long-term effects. And that's what makes policymaking, especially monetary policymaking, a very tricky science. Those are the same basic data we saw in the graph with the red dots and the core PCE inflation. So a moderation of inflation over the next couple of years. But I think the key here, and it's a little bit subtle, is for 2022, the forecast has picked up just a little bit from last quarter. And second, we still have inflation running around 3% perhaps through the end of next year. So basically, no matter what the Federal Reserve does, we're going to see this sort of stubborn inflation linger around at a relatively high level, but it's all relative. 3% inflation, historically and globally speaking, is not bad. It's just above where the Federal Reserve and generally where consumers and businesses from their expectations really want it. So the focus of policy ultimately is, how can I keep expectations at a certain level in such a way that people and businesses do not make decisions about inflation at a higher level, and thus maybe start curbing their consumption, curbing investment, and saving a little bit more than they should in such a way that the economy starts to slow down, not now, but 2 or 3 years from now. Okay, now let's talk about what's going on. And those are just a repeat to show you that the forecast for GDP is going down and unemployment's going up a little bit. Let's look at Marin County. So Marin County's had sort of a funny evolution coming out of the pandemic, in the sense that I wanted to show you two different things. If you think about this picture against the national picture, and if you looked at it for California, California has also basically recovered jobs lost in the pandemic. In Marin County, the labor force has really not come back as it was at the same level as it was before the pandemic yet. And if we seasonally adjust the data, we're still about 93% of the pre-pandemic benchmark at the end of October. So the labor data are only through October for right now at the county and the state level. But both the level of residential employment and the labor force are kind of trending a little bit down and somewhat flat for most of this year, as we're 34 months deep now since January 2020. The key is the following, is that we do need to pick that back up, but how much of this truly tells a tale of what's going on for Marin County employers is a little bit mixed, because we know there's a lot of people who live in Marin County and then work some other place. And there's also a lot of people who are self-employed, and these data do not count the self-employed. If you look at the jobs that are hired by Marin County employers, I'm going to walk you right through the latest data. The same picture applies basically for the national, state, and in the case of Marin County, the local economy, with one big exception. Notice, there's not a lot of recovered industries yet in terms of the seasonally adjusted data for Marin County's industries. Most of them are still negative. Leisure and hospitality squishes together the accommodation and the food services and drinking places, which means it has hotels, motels, bars, restaurants, and event centers all inside that. So that's down still about 18%, the level of employment that we saw in January 2020 seasonally adjusted. The two main industries that have recovered are transportation and logistics, which we already kind of knew had happened, just anecdotally and visually you knew that happened. But construction has also burgeoned along. So one of the good things about the Marin County economy is that construction, being a so-called goods producing industry, means it has a relatively larger multiplier effect when those jobs grow. And that really employs a lot of different industries and a lot of different people. We have, to a certain extent, some of the jobs that have come back since the low point during the pandemic and the initial recovery are being driven by that construction increase in jobs. However, other personal services still down about 12%, even government's down primarily due to teaching, or I should say teachers not coming back in full, about 8.3%. And so we're watching those industries to try, again, same thing we're talking about the national level, is structural change coming to Marin County in such a way that it's going to be hard to get back to the pre-pandemic level? And does that really matter in terms of the overall productivity of businesses that live in Marin County, depending on the industrial mix? Those are some policy questions that organizations like Marin Economic Forum and the County of Marin have to be thinking about looking forward. Okay, so let's talk about housing briefly, and we'll come back to construction employment to wrap up. One metric I look at is median listing prices. And so one of the things we've seen is that those that are putting their houses up for sale have not changed much their outlook in terms of what they think they can sell, except for a couple different places. So Marin County listing prices are still up about 7.5% from where they were last year. These data are brand spanking new. They just came out 2 days ago, about November 2022. So that's Marin County, 7.5%. Imperial County, folks that are putting up their houses for sale are really seeing some more job or more housing price growth there at 30.9 or 30.9% increase from where we were 1 year ago. That is really high. But if you look at the far right-hand side, places like Santa Barbara County, Monterey County, and even Mendocino County are starting to see listing prices lag a little bit. We should expect over 2023 that listing prices are all going to start moving toward that zero line, as folks that put their houses up for sale are going to see themselves in a little bit more competitive environment, and buyers are going to be thinking, well, I need a little bit of a price break because interest rates have gone up. That then leads to this forecast. So the listing prices have not completely adjusted yet, but the forecast is adjusting for a much tougher year next year. However, if you look at these data, these are from October, looking forward 1 year. The November data will come out in about 10 days. And you can see that there are some counties that are hanging on with a positive forecast. It's relatively low, and even those with a negative forecast is still relatively moderate in terms of the negative change. Marin County down just under 4% in the current forecast for the next 12 months starting in October. But the key is, notice that a lot of the more negative numbers, even though they're relatively low, are counties within the Bay Area. Really, in that group, the only two that are outside of it are Yuba and Mendocino County. And Mendocino County, you could say, is still somewhat tied to the sort of northern portion of the Bay Area through Sonoma County and through Napa County. But a lot of what's happening there is in the Bay Area proper. We should expect that because we're already starting at a relatively high level. So you're going to see those prices come back maybe a little bit more quickly than in other places. The critical factor is that, let's say 6 months ago, there were very few negative numbers on the same graph looking forward toward the middle of 2023. Now, the prediction of economic slowdown, relatively higher interest rates, all feeding a lower forecast, now starting to generalize across the counties throughout the state. Well, when you think about what that means, construction jobs are something I watch as a reflection of how housing markets and economic outlook starts to merge together as to whether or not construction jobs are still demanded. And in fact, Marin County seems to be moving right along. These data are monthly and, believe it or not, seasonally adjusted. This shows you how seasonal construction employment can be. It also shows you how deep a cut there was originally and how fast the recovery was as we declared construction an essential industry during the pandemic. Marin County has really been a place where construction has burgeoned over the last 10, 12 years and continues to grow in trend through last month. Now, this is California. So one thing to notice is that the same basic construction incentives exist throughout the state as in Marin County. California has a very similar look. And you can see that California has flattened a little bit on that far right-hand side. That blue line is a little bit flatter over the last couple of months than Marin County is. The Bay Area otherwise, which is going to include Sonoma, Napa, Solano, Contra Costa, Alameda, San Mateo, San Francisco, and Santa Clara counties all squished into one index, has flattened a little bit too. So Marin County seems to still be cooking along. And the point behind that is even if housing prices fade a little bit and interest rates have picked up a little bit, there may be enough wealth and enough projects in the pipeline to keep construction going. And if the downturn is slow enough and quick enough, Marin County may kind of slide through it without a lot of economic damage. Certainly not like what we saw in 2006 and 2009, but this is another reason why Marin County is kind of a special place, because it has that real good mix of relatively high paying jobs, relatively strong wealth, and in a sense has a lot of demand for services in such a way that it can easily bridge over a 12 or 18 month span and not have economic problems generalize, because that wealth is being converted into more jobs and more income support for our local businesses. We will see how construction goes, but keep your eyes on construction jobs over the next 6 or 9 months. That'll tell a tale how things are generalizing locally. So if we look ahead, there's 4 major themes on the national side. We should expect unemployment to rise. We should expect the growth of employment, meaning the growth of jobs, to moderate. I mean, it seems like every time there's a jobs report, we get another positive outlook. That should start to moderate a bit. We should expect interest rates to remain relatively elevated no matter what the Federal Reserve does. We should expect, especially given the last 15 years of interest rates, we're not going back down to the zero lower bound anytime soon. Thus, we shouldn't think that mortgages are going to start moving back down towards 3.25% anytime soon. What that means for businesses and consumer decision-making is a slower path of consumption and investment. We should expect relatively high inflation to also linger. So those 4 things all coming together suggest a much slower economy in 2023. The critical factor is do we see those global issues start to clean up in such a way that we can see more light at the end of the tunnel through 2024 and 2025. But next year is going to be a tough year. For Marin County, expect housing prices are going to fall, but they should do so in a way that's relatively predictable. And overall, the gains over the last few years are not going to be given back. But watch construction employment, and to a certain extent, you should be watching life sciences. Those are the 2 places where Marin County really distinguishes itself on the goods producing or on the scientific side of the Bay Area's economy. And it may be a year next year where we're going to be watching acquisitions in life science and also commercial real estate changes in terms of thematic structural change in those industries. So slower year next year. Marin County will feel some of that, but Marin County's actually got a really strong foundation to move through it. We got to figure out what we're looking at in terms of workforce development. And that'll be a theme for the next couple of months when we come back. And Mike and I are going to talk about that. But I'm now going to hand it off to Mike to talk about some things that are going on with Marin Economic Forum. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. And just so much to unpack there. We really appreciate the update. And I want to let all of our viewers know that this recording of this and the slide deck itself will be sent to you in an email later today. So if you didn't have a chance to jot down all those numbers and notes, it's coming your way later today. I wanted to use the remaining few minutes to touch on something that Rob brought up, this idea of structural change in terms of the Marin economy. So as most of you are aware, the county recently adopted an economic strategy that was produced by MEF. And one of the areas that we focused in on is where is job growth going to occur in certain sectors that exist in Marin, so that through this notion of workforce development that Rob spoke about, how can we help our workforce development practitioners start to look at how they can provide training programs to accommodate where we expect to see job growth. And so on the screen, you can see those sectors that we identified as having the likeliest, strongest growth over the next 5 years, and life sciences, of course, is there. And just a quick note on life sciences, the tech layoffs that we've seen have been in response to very fast growth and then a slowing of the economy, which meant they had to shed some jobs. It's not necessarily the case of life sciences. We don't know exactly why across that sector that layoffs are occurring. They did not have that real quick scale up in response to consumer demand. So we'll have to keep an eye on why that's occurring, because that could be an issue here in Marin. It's one of our cherished sectors, if you will. But again, if you look at these sectors here, with the exception of tourism and hospitality, they're in stark contrast to the slide that Rob showed earlier about where job growth is struggling in retail, in leisure and hospitality, in accommodation. And of course, those are the largest segments of employment here in Marin County. So when Rob talks about structural change, I think one of the messages that we have for policymakers that are so focused on having vibrant downtowns and having merchants that supply the local market being successful, we know that in the coming months and maybe even years, that not only the economic slowdown, but just the nature of consumption through digital purchasing, it's going to have an impact here on how many of these businesses can exist. And so this is something that we're trying to keep an eye on, and the economic strategy itself actually talks about diversification. So for a long time, the majority of businesses in Marin have existed to satisfy local market demand. We saw that leaves you highly vulnerable to an economic shock, like the pandemic, where you have to shut something down, or a natural disaster. So longer term, all the evidence is starting to point to a need for Marin County to start to look at what kind of businesses we have here in order to sustain revenues and even more so create job opportunities in the middle and higher skill wages. And so right now, when you look at Rob present data showing about, in fact, Rob, if I'm right, those jobs have contracted in those sectors. We had a point where we were getting them back, and now they're going down again. And that's not only in response to the slowdown. So I think everybody's going to have to really pay attention into our local services sector, and if that's going to continue to be able to be the engine. Rob made the comment that the wealth that we have in the county has made that somewhat insulated because we can continue to consume. But as we see job layoffs go beyond the tech sector and a slowdown in the economy, what does that mean for the discretionary income that fuels a lot of the purchases and consumption in Marin County? So a lot to look at as we go into the next year. I'm going to wrap it up now because it's 9:30. Thank you for everybody attending. Please do go to the website, marineconomicforum.org, and subscribe to make sure that you're invited to this. We've got a lot of things that are going to be happening in the early months of next year that you're going to want to be involved in. Please tell your friends, follow us on LinkedIn, and I'm going to let everybody get on with your day. Thanks again for attending. We hope you have a great holiday, and we'll see you next year.